Welcome everyone to our Tuesday talk around this current exhibition, Toute Seule. We begin. Where do we begin? The need for these discussions? Should we start off with that?
Yeah, we could start there.
I guess so. Kind of looking at where we're at today compared to, say, I mean, one of the things I thought, again, was extremely kind of relevant when we were discussing this show with Katy was the fact that she said if an exhibition of this sort, you know, regardless of whether the gallery makes a statement out of the all-female element of an exhibition or not, if a similar show was held in you know, say 20 or 30 years ago, it would have had a whole different impact in terms of, again, the conversations and the engagement that kind of came along with it from the audience, or the reaction rather than the engagement, I guess, that came around the exhibition. Whereas today, it's almost not. It can be argued that the female element within an exhibition is not a real kind of talking point or a conversation point.
Well, I think it just depends on what particular legacy or what particular historical view you want to take. So when we were talking about it, I was thinking about Monica Spruce's Eau de Cologne series, which she did in the 1980s, and she did 3 exhibitions of women artists in her gallery as a specific way of focusing on the women artists in Cologne, where she had a gallery, and to promote them in the commercial art market. She felt women were very heavily underrepresented in the commercial art market. They needed a special focus and special attention. And interestingly, recently, she has revived the Eau de Cologne series 30 years later, or 25 years later, to again focus on women artists in a new way and find a way of presenting their work which does draw attention to their contribution to art and discusses them in a professional way and doesn't always reduce the conversation to gender alone or the fact that they are women. Mm-hmm. So it was about kind of presenting a professional view of the woman artist.
At the time, which was kind of required.
Yeah, required and unique. I don't think it's the case today that it's a truly unique position to suddenly represent in commercial galleries women artists. It's not a unique position anymore. Mm-hmm. At that time, it was a very distinctive position that she had.
Yes, and yet, you know, there has been a certain resurgence in this whole movement or discussions around whether it's, you know, female artists being exhibited within galleries or even institutions, anyone from kind of Hauser and Wirth in LA, which opened up with a huge kind of, you know, retrospective of female artist show, an all-female artist show, and that was in a way a statement of the exhibition as well, to, you know, Whitechapel Gallery here, or to, you know, various kind of, or photographers' gallery mm-hmm. as well. I mean, there have over the past kind of 4 or 5 years. So what do we think about, or maybe not even 4 or 5 years, but as far as kind of it, you know, my attention to these things go, it definitely has been, you know, a double take on all of a sudden certain kind of institutions and galleries picking up on this, once again revisiting this discussion, which has been, you know, as you mentioned, has been being discussed already time and time again. So what do we think of that, the need of it, and again, why?
It's quite funny because when you mentioned like the topic of the conversation tonight, I just had a quick look of like, you know, sort of historically how this sort of evolved, that women started getting excluded, I guess, from the art world, and why and where that stemmed from. And so it was really interesting because I was looking at, for example, prehistoric cave paintings. They're supposed to be like, they found, you know, all the fingerprints that were used for the paint, and it was 75% of these paintings were done by women. Mm. So it was very like traditionally, very much like a woman's sort of trade. And then it was sort of evolved, and you saw that women were actually really involved, because often it was in nunneries that they were doing all these amazing illuminations and stuff. And it seems that it's only from the Renaissance that when academies started to develop, sorry, my voice started going on its own.
Out-of-body experience there.
It's like, when academies started to develop, that women started getting excluded from access to actually, the established fine art versus craft. So that sort of got established. And apparently it was because they were doing these huge battle scenes and stuff, and they needed male nudes and corpses to get the proper sort of anatomy of the humans, and they thought it was totally improper for women to go, and so women were completely excluded. And then I think the first woman to be back in the academy in England was in 1936. I forget the name of the baby. Terrible.
Laura Knight.
So it was sort of from the Renaissance to sort of 19th century, beginning 20th century, where women were really struggling to get back into sort of this idea. And so then I guess from then on it's been sort of a fight, and there's been so much of an imbalance that from centuries of exclusion that I guess that it's now that in a way this idea of positive discrimination isn't, it's just just opening doors in an equal way, which
I think it's making visible what was there.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the point. Women were working, they were making work. It was just not, in many cases, it didn't have that visibility. So it's about bringing to light things that are there, but just people didn't have access to and knew about, but also framing them within the context in which they were made, and not just, we were talking about this earlier, not just the men they were working with or against, but the larger context that's part of the work that needs to be done in terms of digging out the positive discrimination, if you may call it so.
But it was still much harder for women to actually do the work. That's the crazy thing. It's actually the few women who did become artists actually had to fight so hard to do it. At the time, they're sort of heroes, amazing.
Well,
This is a perfect segue for...
it's a perfect segue for this. This is my last book, Women Artists Between the Wars, and it's called A Fair Field and No Favour, which is a very famous quote from Winifred Holtby, her book Women. And I bought this because it's the front cover, but also because there's a reproduction of this painting, and I'm happy to show it to everybody. This is by Edith Granger Taylor, and she made this painting, and it was described in 1935 when it was shown as a feminist satire. And what she did was she created this scene, which is based on a painting in the National Gallery, and in it women rise on the backs of men who are male painters, and they have satchels which represent their talent, and there are lots of women with satchels on the ground, but the ones who rise can only rise on the backs of men. Okay, now that was how women artists saw their position in 1935. And maybe in the 1960s, late 1950s, some women artists would have identified with this position and still seen themselves in that light. But I very much doubt that the majority of women artists since the 1960s have seen themselves in this light. So this now represents a historical position of a certain kind of discrimination against women, which has disappeared. But as you were saying, Charlotte, the majority of art school students from the 1890s were women, and yet the minority of artists who were shown in contemporary art galleries and museums were women. So we have this incredible disbalance between 90% or 70 to 90% of women being trained and appearing as 10% of women being shown.
This potentially be related to choice, their own choice in terms of, family life, as we were, which might come into the discussion at a later point, but a choice of not pursuing their careers as artists or whatever they've learned.
Or social pressure.
Or social pressure.
And the fact that, like, but I think you're right that it segues into everything in society. I think you see it in every profession, similar things, and art is just like a...
Yeah, but art happens to be,
The same.
you know, not necessarily be a supremely male-dominated profession like law or medicine, and equally it's not a female-dominated profession like nursing or social work. Mm-hmm. You're sort of in the middle. And actually, when you look at the numbers of women artists who've actually existed in most of the art worlds in Europe, what you're talking about is 40 or 50% of artists through most of the 20th century and into the 21st century being women. So then you've just got to face up to the reality of them actually not having the greatest reputations, not getting the one-person shows, not getting the major museum exhibitions, not being included in major survey shows, and being marginalised.
And Flavia, you were mentioning the kind of, I guess, the need of bringing, which was presumably decided on the institutional level, of bringing female artists within the pop art show that you co-curated at Tate.
Yeah, I mean, it was both an institutional drive to look at women. Definitely, it was part of what felt was important, but also was our own interests as curators to really think of pop art. As part of the process of rethinking pop art, we felt that we had to think of what was women's contribution to a movement that usually is, for the most part, associated with men or men looking at women in their artworks, and very often as objects. And so it was something that we were very keen on discovering, and everywhere we went to research for the show around the world, we came across women who very often were wives of artists who had become very prominent, and they had stayed at home with the children and just been marginalized, really. That's the reality. And, you know, one of them I remember in Spain when I went to see her, she was so surprised that we even found her work. And she said to me, you know, she had gone to an art school, but at that point she had got married, and the pressure was to be a mother, take care of the house, and do her work as an artist really on a side. And you know, to me, it was one of the things that was besides most interesting as an art historian, but also I think relevant as a curator, is to give voice and show things that have been so much put in a corner for all sorts of reasons, mainly society and pressures that women faced.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder, sorry.
No, I just love the idea of the trip. That sounds like an amazing...
Where was it, by the way? Sorry, complete detour.
In the trip? In Spain.
Oh, Spain.
Yeah.
Anyway, no, but I was going to kind of bring up, not is there a need, but was it felt quite forced in a sense, in terms of kind of having a magnifying lens over an issue which, again, has been, you know, targeted and addressed in the past. What I'm saying is, again, what I've earlier mentioned is unless you make it into an issue without kind of going into historical, you know, explanations, I guess, or whatever happened and why we're having this discussion today.
Yeah, but we're fighting the weight of history. That's the problem. You know, we're fighting that kind of shuttering down into discussions of domesticity. We're fighting it all the time. We're fighting all these kind of like feminine assumptions, feminine stereotypes, kind of ideas about somehow that something in the work will demonstrate the gender of the artist.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
Right? That's what we're fighting all the time. Mm-hmm. So it's my other little example. Sorry for the history lesson, but you know, it is important because things have changed, and that's what I really want to point out. Things have changed. The debate has gone on. It's not that we're still back in the 1960s fighting some little corner, you know, and holding protests outside the Whitney Museum, as Nancy Spiro did in the 1970s for representation of women being less than 10% in major survey shows. So we have the nice example of the Tate now in its rehang by Frances Morris. Suddenly, representation of women artists is 1/3 of the show, and they are showing these lovely big sculptural installations on a major scale in a way that they've never done before. In fact, they've probably refused to do up to this point. I have never seen such a display of major sculpture by women as is in the Tate at the moment. Tate Modern, that is. So here is my historical example, which discusses Elizabeth Murray. And this is a very interesting show that was organised in the 80s called Women Making Their Mark. And it's in this period between 70 and 85 that women enter the mainstream. And that's what this catalogue is about. And it's backed up by a whole section at the back of statistics proving the march of women from 10 to 20% in the New York art world, because that's what happened in this period. And this article by Calvin Tompkins called Writing the Balance actually discusses Elizabeth Murray's work and how she felt all the time that she was fighting to counter the very macho attitudes towards what painting or sculpture could be, and that the assumption that women could not make great art. And that she was really fighting that in everything she did, in the way that she made her work, in how she presented her work on a large scale, in how she engaged in public art projects. She really felt that she was fighting a corner because of deeply seated prejudices in the art school. Hopefully we live in more enlightened times in contemporary art schools, certainly compared to when I went to art school in the 80s, early 80s. We hope that most people's education is not saturated with negative stereotypes.
I don't know if we've...
I don't think we've come that far.
I don't think so. I went to see that show at the Photographers Gallery, and it's about the feminist avant-garde, and it's all about the 70s, and it's all done by women in the 70s. And if you look at all the issues raised, they're literally the same issues. If you curated a show today, it'd probably be very similar issues that would resurface.
With artists.
Yeah, with artists,
of
today. Because women artists in terms of reappropriation of the body, all these kind of issues that sort of we haven't really gone hugely beyond, sadly. It feels like. I don't know. Yeah.
But is it a point of conversation in terms of kind of making it as these issues, like you say, as a starting point from an artist's perspective, where you explore as a male artist would explore his own issues with, whether it's with whatever Freudian kind of relationship he had with his mother or whatever personal issues, they might kind of go through. So more from kind of an artistic side rather than it being kind of almost an attack or a criticism of a social structure or maybe kind of going into that political stream in a way as an artist.
But I think a lot of people again explore these issues as personal issues, but then they become attacks on society because of the work and what they're saying, and so I guess you explore something very personal, but then it has a relevance in terms of the cultural setting or the societal setting in which it exists, and therefore you redefine things little by little. But it definitely feels that it's a conversation that we haven't. That's just starting. Because if you think of it in terms of a historical context, it started sort of in the 70s. It's not that long. It just, And also this idea, as you were mentioning, Katie, of this idea of female artists' work always being sort of referred to as feminine, or tendencies being pinned on it, definitions being applied to it as if to compound it or somehow to organize it in a specific way, or contain it is the word, I guess. Male artists' work would not often be described as male, because this idea of the masculine and the feminine exists in every one of us, and a woman can explore masculine elements as a man can explore feminine elements. The separation of them is just a way we use to order the world or name things, but it's sort of arbitrary. It's so permeable, isn't it? These notions of feminine and masculine. Even this definition of what it is to be a woman is like, you know, is it Simone de Beauvoir said, you're not born a woman,
Yeah,
you become one. You're like defined by society.
But I think we really need another language. You know, it's like we need new terms in our language to try and overcome what naturally falls into place, or what we treat as common sense. You know, the constant link between the work and the biography of the artist, for example. We need another way of imagining that relationship, a more complex way of imagining that relationship, rather than returning all the time to a kind of form of hagiography. You know, that the work speaks to the biography of the artist. Well, yes, it's made in a particular time and in a particular place, but maybe it also speaks to the other art around it, and that actually we should think about it in relationship to the other art around it. Like maybe we should talk about Elizabeth Murray in relationship to Jennifer Bartlett, who's on the front cover, and in relationship to Judy Rifka, you know, and we should talk about Nancy Spiro in relationship to Carolee Schneeman's work on sexuality, you know, and a different approach to politics in Martha Rosler. You know, we should put people into these kind of like different connections, which would allow the work to talk.
And yet it's female artists compared to female artists.
No, I'm doing that deliberately, and you know why. because the majority of the time, women artists are just compared to male artists, you know, and it became part of the ways in which we talk about artwork that we always name the status through their association with men. You know, this woman was married to X, therefore she was in that group of artists. You know, and it was always this kind of leaders and followers kind of relationship. And this is what I mean about the stereotype that we fall into of leaders and followers. The men are assumed to be leaders, the women are assumed to be followers. But it's an assumption, because we don't know. And most of the time we don't know. What about the fantastic exchanges between Nancy Spiro and Leon Golob? You know, she was an influence on him, he was an influence on her. It's kind of mutual exchange, a very long partnership that they had, you know, as in their relationship as artists and as man and wife. We cannot make those assumptions anymore, that it's kind of one-way hierarchy between them.
But do you think it's still so much so that it's considered one-way hierarchy?
Yes, yeah, I do.
Don't you think it's increasingly that's being a myth that's being debunked, to this one-way stream where the woman is always looking up at the man?
I would hope so.
Because, I mean, maybe I have a skewed impression, but from, you know, even my master's, my BA degree, I remember that increasingly that was a conversation being had. I remember specifically the case of Robert and Sonia Delaunay, and the idea, you know, Sonia is just a follower of Robert. And I remember a whole class where we were thinking exactly the opposite. What if, you know, Robert was taking from Sonia as much as she was giving him? Maybe I had a very positive experience, I guess. But
okay, but because I was in New York, I went to see the Russian Revolution show, because there's another one down the road, but I went to see the Russian Revolution show at MoMA. And when MoMA opened in 1935, the only things that they included of Lyubov Popova and Natalia Goncharenko were stage designs, very small drawings and stage designs. So you go to an exhibition, how many years? That's 80 years later, and the women artists are given more space, and the women artists are shown more. But what are we looking at most of the time? Stage designs, costume designs, and we're given the impression that these women were applied artists and not painters, right? And the same myths go on. They haven't shifted that dramatically, because MoMA's collection doesn't contain those works. You know, so they would have to rapidly revise. They've had this big project for 5 years. They had a project about re-evaluation of women artists at MoMA. This is the outcome of a re-evaluation, just larger space given to women. The fundamental premises haven't shifted that much. Maybe there has been a little more re-evaluation. And that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm pointing towards, that I wish we had a kind of a much stronger overturning of our language and ideas. That hasn't happened yet. We're still on the way.
So how do you think we go about it in terms of kind of, you know, each doing our part in kind of heading towards this direction of changing the language and the way we talk about the subject without it being, you know, a repetition of sort, and yet achieving what it has to achieve?
Well, Charlotte, let's talk about your work.
So to the artist. The artist is in the limelight. So let's talk about
No, because we were having this conversation about, I said I don't know many men who make work about motherhood, unless it's quite sentimental. And actually I know a lot of women who make an awful lot of work about motherhood, which is very pointed and very ambivalent and very pointing to the difficulties of motherhood, the pleasures and the pains of motherhood. To use Lucy Little's words.
No, it's true. I guess, yeah, no, it's true. I guess it's kind of perhaps idealized with perhaps with men, whereas it's such a painful experience for both the mother and the child. So I guess her representation will be quite different. If our woman's representation will be quite different. But like the representation of women's bodies, often by women, is much less. How do you say, distant, and so in a way it's just less respectful in the funny way, like it's less awesome as in awe, but I don't know, in terms of redefining the language I mean, I guess we just got to continue doing lots of things, you know, and yeah.
But do you think you're redefining the language here when you're speaking about the intimacy, but also the fragmented nature of that relationship?
Well, that was so the idea was really to sort of, I guess, but to show, yes, those multiple sort of aspects of what it means to be a mother, and also the brokenness of it, and the fact that it's not like a sort of wholesome experience that completely makes sense, and that, you know, it's they're just fragments, I guess, that you try and put together to understand what the hell's going on. It's not that clear. And the ambivalence of the face, I guess, and the separation and the multiple roles. But it was also, this piece was also because of the sort of the kind of prejudice against breastfeeding in public. We were quite keen to do a 3-meter woman breastfeeding as a kind of fuck you to everyone who was not into that, who felt too precious to be able to see a nipple in a non-commercialized environment, or not to sell some yogurt or whatever. So yeah. And then it's like the structure's made in cortine metal, which is this rusty metal that's poured with acid and stuff. So the idea is also to very much inscribe the portrait in time, and sort of as something that was made today, but to be rediscovered in the future. And I guess inscribes it in a way in the tradition of women, but it's very much like obviously part of the tradition of the mother and child that has religiously, historically been at the core of art, actually, funny enough. And then it was interesting with this relationship of the feminine and the masculine, and this idea that obviously everyone's first relationship to the world is with the feminine, and this kind of, and then this sort of separation that happens between the mother and child, which is the beginning of the self and the beginning of of one's identity as as an individual, but in that separation, there's a huge amount of pain for both parties, but it's also the beginning of our inscription in the symbolic order, and I guess that gap and that bridge is what we try and like bring together when we do anything artistic or write, or when we talk even.
But you see, your work in this show is, I mean, that's what I like about this show, is that it's 5 completely different women, 5 completely different approaches to work. There's nothing identical that necessarily links them.
Yeah.
The video work in here is about a masculine body. It's about a woman looking at a male body and looking at the ways in which the torso collapses in new technology. This is like completely different attitude to the body. And again, it's different from Elizabeth Murray's pieces, which are, quite tortured, gutsy, broken up, cut up, incoherent, but it's not the same fragmentation as yours.
So I guess so long as this becomes the starting point of discussion in a way, whether it's from the artistic side, curatorial side, if it's, if it nudges us towards a bigger conversation that can that can go beyond, in a way, gender, discrimination or not, positive discrimination on all the other terms kind of thing, so long as it opens up the door to a wider discussion, I guess. Can we agree on that? Then it's worth having these kind of discussions over time and time again.
Yeah, because ultimately, what are women artists making? They're making art. They want their work to be evaluated as art. They don't want their work to be evaluated as women. That's always been the ambition of feminist artists.
Well, otherwise it's way too constrictive, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't even mean anything to be evaluated just as a woman artist. I guess it's like devoid of. It doesn't really make. It's like it's just human art.
We sort of need to get to the point where we just look at the work and don't look at the fact that it's a man or a woman. It's the work speaking for itself, I guess, is the ultimate goal.
Which links it back to the biographical elements that you were thinking would be interesting to.
Yeah, I mean, this is a play, and the title of the show, Toute Seule, Always Alone, or entirely alone. Women are not isolated geniuses. They have a community, they work in a peer group. They went to college with different people. They identify with particular traditions and legacies. That's what we should be exploring. That's what we should be engaging with when we look at their work. We owe it to them.
Absolutely. Can we open up on that note to the audience? And if you've got any comment, question, please, microphone. It's over there.
I've got a couple of points to make. One is the artistic couple Rodin and Camille Claudel, imbalance, but she destroys herself. And another one is Queen Victoria forbidding her artistic daughter, Princess Louise, to have anything to do with the first female doctor, because Queen Victoria thought that women shouldn't work, shouldn't have a profession. And so all those prejudices
So we got over that Victorianism now.
Yeah, we have. I just wanted to bring up those points. It's something that I researched quite extensively. The book by Princess Louise, who was the rebellious daughter, was written by Lucinda Dickens Hawksley. And I've read the books about Rodin. Thank you.
Thank you.
Didn't Queen Victoria not believe us that lesbianism was possible? She banned homosexuality, but she didn't think that. She didn't even conceive of lesbianism, so it was never banned in England, which I thought was quite a funny thing.
She was the head of the whole empire, and she didn't believe in profession. It was just split, ridiculous. In the end, they did make up. The mother and daughter did make up.
Well, didn't they?
Towards the end of Queen Victoria's life. There was always a shift.
Thank you.
I'd like to take up the remark that we haven't gone much beyond the 1960s. And I think this is very interesting because it introduces a comparative element into the discussion. If women have been able to get into a fuddy-duddy profession like law, if they've been able to more or less take over medicine, then why has the art market lagged behind? And related to this, not necessarily connected to it, are two questions for me. We haven't looked sufficiently at what women have done and what women do. If you're frozen out of one area, you have to move into another. Now, I'm sorry to say I don't know many women artists, but the ones I do have very varied work. They've not necessarily been able to sell their work, so they've moved into posters. They've moved into political movements, they've moved into graphic art, they've moved into commercial art, they've changed over to pottery, they've gone in for photography. But when I go around the galleries, this isn't represented in any significant way. And it's also, of course, true of men. And it's one reason why putting together a decent picture of British art from the First World War on comes up with such feeble results. Because they're working for the railway companies, they're working for the shipping companies, and so on and so forth. And the second thing is, what's happened to the art market itself and the narrow world of connoisseurship? And isn't this where things go wrong? It's not necessarily the fault of men, it's the fault of particular groups of men, and the most important group of men are those who run galleries and who work with the public collections. And it's these people we need to look at. So we need to look at who's buying the stuff, and we need to look at what other things women are doing. And I think in that way we will get a more dynamic and fuller picture of this particular tragedy. Sorry to go on.
No, thank you. I just think in terms of, from kind of a commercial gallery's point of view, when you mentioned it's not represented within the gallery's context, do you mean that kind of, what did you mean by that? So the fact that the female artists haven't been maybe collected that kind of widely or aren't supported by the market itself and the industry, and the lack of that is kind of...
Just to give you an example, I had a neighbour of mine who came from Spain, who went to Paris from Barcelona, I think just probably at the end of the war, with a letter of introduction to Picasso, which she never delivered to him. She never took the letter around. But her family were actually connoisseurs, they were well-known connoisseurs in Barcelona. Now, she came to London and she had a fantastic career as a commercial artist. She never exhibited in a gallery, but was a person of huge talent and vivacity and life and energy. So I think the galleries have to, yes, it's this area here that's responsible, particularly because our definitions of art have broadened. It seems to me the world of the galleries and the commercial market hasn't in any way kept up. And I don't think even the galleries, public galleries, have kept up. I go to Tate Modern and I'm faced with a great void in huge areas of late 20th century and 21st century art. And I'm cruelly disappointed, time and time again.
I just wasn't sure what you mean by unrepresented, because I think if again, from the gallery's perspective and maybe from the institutional side, you can kind of chip in, I guess, and address that. But I guess from the gallery side, I think, again, we go back to the point of the more focus you add to it, the more of an issue it becomes. So as a gallery, do you need to necessarily have a focus on female artists, which, some Mayfair dealers have had that kind of focus for the past, 20, 30 years, and they're still continuing with that, and it's their kind of thing in a way. But do we help the conversation or the kind of the issues, like Charlotte said earlier, do we help that by actually having it kind of having it forced in a way onto the exhibition program of the gallery? Or again, there are collectors who only specialize in not specialize, but are focused on collecting female artists, and it's great. Do we need more of them? Or is it about having a bigger kind of, a bigger picture, like Katy was saying, I guess, and what do you guys think?
There has been a sea change. There has been a sea change recently, and I think that one of the it's hard to get a sense of how much of a transformation has happened in the last 20, 30 years, right? Compared to, part of it is to do with the kind of rigidity of modernism. The rigidity of modernism in the gallery was very much about painting and sculpture, and that's what needed to be shown. And one of the ways in which the modernist avant-garde, particularly the male avant-garde, decided that they could assure the quality of their work was by excluding women who were their peers. And there are lots of very good examples of male shows putting forward their avant-garde statements by excluding their wives and girlfriends who were also part of their peer group, who were also making work at the same time, in order to make much more assertive a kind of macho avant-gardism in the face of an art world that they thought was over-academic, over-decorative, over-realist. Right? And in order to make their statement, which was clean and sort of like avant-gardist and new, right? They felt that they had to be super selective in their presentation of works. So you get these strange anomalies between male and female that happen in this kind of presentation of the new art. Right? Equally, in the 70s, you get a presentation of the new art where it's a refusal of the gallery. Artwork should be outside the gallery. It should be in a field. It should be, in a festival. It should be nothing to do with this whitewash wall that modernism represented. We should get away from that. We should have art on the streets. Should have art engaged in a public dialogue. We should have ephemeral events, a performance which will never be captured, not even in photography or film. Right? So, there are trends and tendencies which are for and against the gallery, for and against the museum in the last 50 years that we also have to account for.
Yes, I don't want to say anything more. I don't know if people, sorry, but I would provoke me to one further statement, then I'll shut up. Two preconditions for success. One, how do we measure how much we achieved and how much we haven't achieved? And that hasn't been answered. And that's a question which can be tested. And the second thing is, until we know what women have been up to, if I can put it that way, what they're doing, what activities that they're involved in, then no one. They will not be, we can't represent them. So we need to know much more about women and what they've done.
Well, we're not short of information. I mean, there are thousands of books about women artists now, which I wouldn't have said like 40 years ago there were. 40 years ago, a book on a woman artist was a rare event. It was a very special thing. Now we've got hundreds of biographies. If you go through any good art bookshop and you look at the monographs, you can find 50% of them are by and about women in the contemporary period. You're not just looking at, the 50th Jackson Pollock book or the 95th Picasso book or the 120th Warhol book. There are other people in the world.
If I would say that it is mostly, brought about women, female, particularly female artists, I think. She's worth exploring. She's a very interesting and lovely lady who I met at the National Portrait Gallery. And so it's worth reading her books.
Say her name again, I didn't catch it.
Lucinda Dickens,
Ah.
descendant, Hawksley.
I just want to quickly say, but what about the male artists that are unrepresented and are unheard? You know, there's a bunch of other, you know, regardless female or male, there are quite a few artists that aren't being recognized right now. Recognized as in are finding it difficult to get into the limelight, whether it's, you know, having the access to the collectors or even having the time of day by the dealers and the gallerists, etc. So I think even that can be kind of extended, that argument, I guess, extended to cover, to go beyond. I'm not sure if I'm digging myself a grave here, but I just wanted to throw it out there.
Well, I mean, that's part of like also kind of a recent shift in terms of like looking at narratives that are outside the more known Western ones and focusing also on what was happening elsewhere in the world is part of this sense of rediscovery that goes beyond just women, but encompasses also men.
Mm-hmm. Which, by the way, we didn't touch on, just quickly. Oh, sorry.
I'd like to raise one more point. I wanted to thank you, Mila, for having had the possibility of meeting a female artist, Jane McAdam Freud. Mm-hmm. I'm still in touch with her.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank
we have
you
an
very
exhibition
much.
of hers coming up, well, end of the year. But yeah.
And she invites me to private views as well.
Excellent. Oh, good.
Thanks
I'm
a lot.
glad. We've got Calliope Lemos here. If we can discuss all the artists of the gallery, it can be a self-promotional, nice little panel. But no, I'm glad. Which something I wanted to quickly, I don't know again if it's relevant at all. The show that you've put on recently in Brazil.
In Argentina.
In Argentina. And you mentioned it was an all-female show.
No, it wasn't an all-female show. It was actually a show looking about how artists deal with technology and a very fast-changing world. So the theme was not gendered in any way. And funny enough, at one point when I was going through the list of artists that we had reached out to and that had accepted, I realized that the great majority were women. And this was completely unconscious. And to me, it felt a good sign of, you know, a positive change in the sense that, you know, I wasn't looking or focusing on this is going to be a show about women. It was a theme, and the work that was selected happened to be by women. And
did you find that had a better, not a better, but a more of an active response? Let's say, was it talked about more in the press? Do you think was it?
No, it was.
Was it celebrated in a way more?
It was their works that were talked about. It wasn't the idea, it's more women. Mm-hmm. Which I think is positive.
That's great.
Absolutely. Thoughts? No. Sorry. Yes.
I just wanted to see how much you think of the kind of lack of women in the art over, you know, the past century or decades is symptomatic of what we're seeing across the board in many different industries. It's not unique to the art world. And obviously you can work on things from within the art world, but how much you think of how much emphasis you can put on that versus what's going on across the board of women in the workplace, in the general professional industry, because you don't just see that lack thereof in the art world or in just the creative industries. You see it across the board. So I wouldn't say it's just symptomatic of the art. So I think it's something you can work on, something inside or from outside, and how you think that those two work together.
Well, the problem that we have is in fine art, for a very, very long time, 40 or 50% of those people who have become and dedicated their life or chosen to be visual artists are women. So we're in this situation where the number of people who are actually practicing artists is very high amongst women. It's not a minority thing, but what does it mean to be an artist? Well, you're a kind of freelance professional, aren't you? You know, you're only as good as your last show. You're only as good as, you know, the ways in which you present yourself, how visible you can be, you know, who pays attention to your work. And so, I mean, some people have described artists as kind of in a begging bowl culture, really, because their total reliance upon all kinds of markers of recognition and symbolic capital and, you know, visibility in the press and visibility in publications. And some of those things are really, really hard to secure. And sometimes we know, because there is a token system, there is a star system, that some people are fostered and petted and developed and allowed to mature and given every opportunity. And some people struggle continuously the whole of their lives to bring their work to any kind of recognition. And it doesn't mean that they stop making art, it's just to do with the levels of visibility and recognition that they receive.
But it is true that I remember also what Victoria said, that it's a very like endemic problem, like equal pay is still not assured. I mean, there's lots of like very concrete things that still definitely need fighting for, that aren't like abstract, I mean, that are very, very real. And even in terms of like, you know, little girls, how they're raised, like in terms of self-confidence, in terms of being given the right to believe that you can do stuff, in terms of not being told that you have to dress up for ages. And like, you know, while there was a really good quote in this book called Girls, actually, about the Charles Manson murder, totally different, but like, where they were saying all the time that we spent trying to please boys, other people, the boys were becoming themselves. And by the time they were 18, they were actually individuals, and we were just realizing that we had to become ourselves at that stage. And there is like so many things that are still in the way, I think, of women achieving their full potential, or even just believing that they can achieve their full potential. And I think like even the crazy thing is like, I feel like, you know, the problem is like women are misogynist themselves. You know, not in, but I feel it myself. Like sometimes I find myself with my daughter, I'm going to be like, say things that I'm like, oh my God, how is that possible? Or like, you know, put a thing in her hair or whatever, you know, just you catch yourself actually following the stereotypes of like continuing like something that's actually been slavery. I mean, women have been like literally in a state of slavery for, I mean, it's insane. I was rereading like Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1791, an amazing woman. And you know, you've got to remember, like, women were not allowed anything. They weren't allowed property, they weren't allowed to divorce, they weren't allowed to, you know, manage their own money, they weren't allowed they weren't allowed to vote, obviously. I mean, they weren't allowed to think, you know, they weren't allowed the right to their own body. I mean, it's, you know, we've got to remember it's like super, super recent. I mean, in America, they're still rediscussing abortion. I mean, do you imagine? These are like issues that are like, I mean, they're so real. And you know, in loads of, I mean, I don't know, it's like such a real issue. So I totally agree with you that it's something that it's so societal and cultural and endemic, and it's something that I think women have to fight for every day to try and make sure that our daughters are more emancipated, better, stronger than us.
But if you think about it, you know, what is art? Art is the kind of highest form of symbolic capitalism, or symbolic capital. I mean, it doesn't have to be entirely always exchange for money, but it is something we, you know, admire, look up to. We want, you know, someone like me who's been following art for a very long time, you know, and looking at trends and tendencies and changes and thinking about how different tendencies emerge and kind of like presented again and again and neutralized or celebrated in different ways. I mean, it becomes quite consuming, you know, in terms of how we start to think about the world. And you know, we don't want our ideas entirely shaped by a masculine perspective. You know, we can see the difference between that shaping of a masculine perspective and the ways in which we see ourselves and we see another set of concerns or issues, just as this guy was expressing about, photography, mixed media, applied arts. There are many more dimensions to this question.
And that's the thing that's really interesting in terms of also the redefinition of I think it's like this idea of just breaking a monopoly, because it makes the world more interesting and bringing different perspective, whether it be people from different cultures, art from different cultures, or art from different sexes. But it's funny that women are sort of now treated in the same way that this idea of minority cultures, when it's an equal number of population. I mean, it's crazy. It's not it's quite a mad sort of.
Do you think at some point we'll reach the time when this discussion will be so irrelevant and so kind of, because it will be the beautiful.
People have been asking me that for 40 years now. So I'm sorry, it's not going away. It's not going away. We're still going to be replaying it in 40 years' time.
Yeah.
Because things do change very slowly. Hopefully we've got rid of the Victorianisms, but I'm not sure, because I still think they affect us, which bathroom to go in.
But things come back.
But now you have the transgender bathroom as well. I'm not sure if
Are they doing a separate one?
They have a third one now.
Yeah, but how recent is that?
Let's add that to the mix.
How recent is that? We still have, buildings structured, doors for boys and doors for girls.
And the last segregated space, public space, the toilet.
Yeah.
I know, it's true.
Yeah, it's true.
That's funny.
Yeah.
Question here.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know, but Persian is one of the sort of non-gender languages, and I think it's one of the oldest ones as well. So I sort of wondered whether the evolution of language and the sort of constant sort of seek for categorization and sort of making difference between male and female sort of influence and sort of led to the discrimination of women throughout history. So I don't know.
That is a big question.
Yeah. Quite enormous. I don't feel I really have the knowledge.
It's super interesting, because I guess Persians, Iran's I didn't know that about Persians. It's really interesting, but it's definitely not known for its equal rights. But also it's funny because actually English is very... Sorry?
But I'm thinking it's quite kind of ironic, because on the one hand, if you've got the language, which I wasn't aware of as well, but if you've got on the one hand a language which doesn't kind of have specifics around gender, and then on the other hand, I guess the religious, or arguably there's a religious undertone which kind of slightly, what's the politically correct word here? Undermines.
Yeah.
Hold on. Undermines people. The religious, since the 79. Yeah.
I think that prior to, I just think prior to that they were more. They had sort of respectful levels of equality. I think even by today's standard, although I'm not old enough to know for sure.
Mm-hmm. Which again feeds back into this kind of idea of cycles, I guess, of how the question has been, you've been asked the same question, will we ever kind of get past the stage of bringing the same conversation up over and over again for the past 40 years, and we're still not, although, like you said, we're past the Victorian stage, but then who knows, this might be, as you mentioned, in the US, there's we're revisiting now the discussion
but
of
also
abortion
resurgence
rights.
of religion. I think religion's always been so tied also to the quashing, the squashing or whatever of there's a sort of terror of women, I think, and it's interesting also to see in terms of artworks, in terms of competition in the workforce, in terms of so many different elements, but yeah, I do find it quite interesting, the terror of the womb.
Yeah, monstrous women. Bring back monstrous women.
What do you think?
I don't know. It just, I think for me, I feel throughout history, we sort of always sort of put into the man's hands, just sort of translation of our history. It's always been scribes. There was monks, which is monks. Sorry, that was sort of translating our history. So I feel maybe back in the days when you were talking about in the case when we had sort of women's hands and stuff like that, I feel there was more of a balance between all of it, because we were not trying to make sense between what was to be a woman and what was to be a man. It was more of a natural dynamic that was happening between the two of them. So I feel like, yeah, since we sort of like tried to write everything down, we've tried to categorize everything and sort of like put a gender on things to be more accurate about what we were describing. So I feel that's, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it's super interesting, isn't it, this notion of like language and how actually the definition of language then actually creates the problematics.
Yeah.
You know, it's the same for like time and like understanding of time and like ourselves and all the words that lack. And like it comes back to what you were saying about needing to redefine a language that can appropriately give
but
space.
we're heavily reliant now on written language. You know, we, as art historians, Flavia will back me up on this, the people are trained to crawl through what has been said by others.
Yeah.
And what has been said by others is very rarely questioned. It's endorsed.
Yeah,
It's actually used to create a case, you know, or a historical case. It's very rarely put to under any critical scrutiny for its value systems. Very rare. And that's what I mean about needing a kind of transformation in language.
Yeah, I guess that sort of like brings back to sort of like what is that sort of like sacred notion of like what is all that is sort of like you know, like full of power and sort of like full of meaning, and that is what is right. So I feel like maybe we need to change that, and like, yeah, maybe what is all is not always right, and you know, it's not always true. So yeah, definitely.
The alternative history, I think you've got to do it.
Yeah, but we are over deferential to text.
Yeah.
We are, and actually, you know, that's what's I hope was nice. We need to trust our responses to works, you know, and you know, we could talk about the works and have in this room like 15, 20, 30 different responses to the works, and that would be an interesting conversation. Yeah. You know, much more than our attachment to correct reading or, you know, close reading or knowing what the truth. That's what we need to discuss, you know. Like, how does Nancy Spiro's discussion of abuse against women and children affect us today? You know, do we see that problematic that she has put in these tiny collages and, you know, clips of courts and testimonies and legal frameworks? Do we see that differently today? You know, that to me, there are a lot of interesting questions in the works that are here that would be really worth pursuing or thinking about more deeply.
I think you make a very good point, especially as art historians, that we always feel obliged to look at what has been said, what has been written, and very often not really look at the work, what it's telling us. I mean, I'm teaching a course at UCL, and I realized with my students that the first essays that they gave me were all about mishmashing other people's opinion without ever really engaging with the work.
Yeah.
And it's incredible. That's the people we're training to do that.
Well, I have the privileges of working with artists, so I teach artists to speak, you know, try and get them to recover some sense of a language to frame their ideas.
It adds some courage to actually go and interpret it like a piece of work and sort of like put your opinion forward. You know, it's much easier to relate to the artist's opinion because, you know, there's a lot of different things like interacting with your interpretation. So you might not want to, I don't know, like offend them by interpreting it in a different way, but somehow it makes the beauty of the work as well. So
I think we have to overcome that intimidation.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I think of when I write about an artist's work, I get the chance to write about it often for the first time. That's a wonderful privilege. But I don't expect that to be the definitive reading. Yeah. I'd be very unhappy if it was. It's just, you know, my opinion. My opinion is as good as anybody else's. It might be informed by other things, but if you're just judging it on the emotional reaction to the work and what you can see going on in the work, you know, you have something to say. Every one of you, as audience, you have something to say about the work.
Thank you.
feel that often when we discuss a woman's artist work, we always think of her as this is a woman artist. I think it would be a validation of the artist if we just think of the work as the work of an artist, rather than this is a woman artist. And really evaluate the work next to another artist's work and next to another artist's work, and forget about the gender and forget about, everything else. So, yes, I would welcome discussion about artist's work, whether she's a woman or a man, forgetting about the discrimination and everything else. It is a struggle. I have faced a struggle myself in my life, how to study, get there, and so on and so forth. But beyond that, I would like my work to be evaluated for what it says, beyond the fact that I went through the struggle.
But we're getting to that point, aren't we getting to that point now? That we are finally recognising there are so many women artists' work, that they're not some special, rare, elusive category, that they seem to be in the past, that our lack of historical knowledge of them in the past was actually forcing us towards that conclusion. So when we start to acknowledge that women artists are amongst all artists as not a minority or a minoritized group, but as part of the profession and part of the contemporary moment, then we have to change our language. Then we have to change how we evaluate things. And we have to change how we start to regard gender as part of that question. And it becomes less charged, right? But it's how to normalize a situation which has been subject of horrible historical distortion. That's what we ultimately are trying to achieve.
Because it's crazy, because even some texts that were written by women and were signed as by their male pen name were really, like, for example, I'm just thinking still Mary Wollstonecraft, but were really praised in the press, and as soon as they found out that she was a woman, she was completely discredited. Like, literally, her work was totally undermined a week later, just because of the fact that they didn't want a woman to be talking about these issues. Obviously, we're not there now, but it's true that there is this sort of wave of, I don't know, it's just quite interesting, the historical aspect of it, I do think. That explains why we're having these discussions.
Organize an exhibition, for instance, invite artists to submit their works without them, and not display the names whether they're male or female, and then ask the audience to guess if they want to, but maybe or just give an opinion about the work itself.
But even an act like this would already, we're already again putting a magnifying glass on the gender element if we're asking the audience, who do you think this, is this done by a male or a female artist? So
no,
it's the same.
It's just for a joke.
No, there was a response.
It would be interesting to know whether there is any, whether people's opinions will not have anything to do with gender. Simply, they will judge the works themselves.
But you see, there are plenty of people who have tried such experiments.
Have they?
Yes, and it's actually the whole principle of the open exhibition.
Really?
Yeah, the open society exhibition, that you don't know who the artist, that they're judged blind without the name. But people actually do know. And people actually do make assumptions about work. So they assume pastel colours, they assume strong forms, they assume dynamic compositions are male and weak compositions and sort of blousy work is female, and, work with textiles as women and work with steel is men. And, they make all these assumptions all the time. Yeah, and they're often wrong. Yeah, but they expect the body of the artist to be in the work. Physical projection, the body of the artist in the work.
Should we wrap up on that note? I don't know if that was a... Yeah, that was a good note to wrap up on, wasn't it? I mean, literally an hour-long discussion, and we didn't really come to any, breakthrough theories and no, we did actually. The need for language.
Redefinition and the alternative history.
Alternative history, that's a good, Right? We're happy with that? No more questions,
Genderless
right?
curation.
And what?
And just curation that ends up being lots of women but just because...
Yeah.
For their work.
Accidental, yeah.
That's
right?
cool.
Yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for coming. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you.